Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your patience in holding. We now have your presenters in conference. It is now my pleasure to introduce today's first presenter, Mr. Chris Hund.
Hi, hello everybody. Welcome to the TeamSTEPPS for Office-Based Care online webinar on challenges and successes in the small office setting. I'm your host, Chris Hund, Director of the National Implementation of TeamSTEPPS program, and I'd like to thank you very much for joining us today. This webinar is part of a library to support all of your work on TeamSTEPPS for Office-Based Care Online. This webinar, along with the others, is part of the program, and they will be useful for getting you your Master Trainer designation at the end of the TeamSTEPPS for Office-Based Care Online work you've been doing. Thank you very much to the Agency for Healthcare Research and Quality, which is part of the Department of Health and Human Services, for funding the TeamSTEPPS for Office-Based Care Online work, as well as all of the other TeamSTEPPS work. It's very appreciated. They're moving the ball forward in the patient safety and quality improvement field through teamwork and communication. Today you're in for a real treat. Your presenter is Ken Plitt. He is the Principal and Senior Trainer and Consultant at TeamIQ in Seattle, Washington. Ken is a TeamSTEPPS Master Trainer, a nurse, and has been involved with TeamSTEPPS for many years. He has extensive experience working in both hospitals and in medical offices, and I feel that he's going to be able to bring a lot of great ideas to the fore today. So without further ado, I'm going to toss it over to Ken.
Thanks, Chris, and welcome to everybody. I'd like to just start off by amplifying a couple of points Chris made. The context for my commentary today comes from a lot of experience in a variety of settings. I've had the opportunity during my 32-year career as a nurse anesthetist to work in several office settings, many of them quite small, where there's a single procedure room, maybe a single physician that owns the practice. I've also had the opportunity as a master trainer through one of the TeamSTEPPS regional training sites to work with a number of teams that have come in, organizations across the country, large and small, and many of those have extensive ambulatory care networks. And then finally, in my work as an independent consultant and trainer, one of the real values of that has been my ability to follow up with organizations that have initially started the journey through master training, and then as many as 4 and 5 years post to follow their journey and see how they've come out and help them along the way. So without further ado, let's move into this. I'd like to point out from a disclosure standpoint, I mentioned my independent contractor status. There may be times during the presentation that I will reference certain resources, books, companies. I have no financial arrangements with any of those. I've just found that they've helped inform me in my understanding of teams and teamwork, and may be useful to you as well. Objectives for today include taking a look at the characteristics of the office environment that particularly make it susceptible to risk and breakdowns in communication and team performance. Secondly, we'll look at a concept known as change capacity within the medical office. And by the way, my terminology of medical office is really generic. It extends to dental offices, physical therapy practices. So consider this to be broad-reaching. And then third, we'll look at some practical tips I might be able to offer you newly minted master trainers to help you select, introduce, and then embed TeamSTEPPS techniques as part of a broader culture of safety. So unfortunately, risk does exist in the medical office. It's not just in the acute care hospital and emergency department settings. We know from experience that many of the interactions in the office is one staff member with a patient at a time. That in itself creates some challenges. And then taking that step further, we know that there's risk when certain needed services are extended beyond the office. And the photos here just give an example of a lab test. Blood work that's drawn is sent to a reference lab, and yes, it's out of your hands, and yet all along those succeeding steps until it gets to the point of information returned to the clinician's office for that final conversation with a patient, there are plenty of challenges and points where things can go wrong. That's backed up by statistics, and we know that ambulatory care involves more than 1 billion visits each year, and diagnostic error and delays in diagnosis seem to be the hallmark of where things go wrong. A study by Bishop in 2011 looked at medical liability claims and noted that half of those took place in the outpatient setting. And of those, you can see 3/4 were due to errors in diagnosis and treatment. So that's the nature of what we're dealing with. I would point you to a guide and white paper, actually a technical brief that AHRQ put out in 2016. Through a combination of key informant interviews and a review of the relevant literature, the authors attempted to answer some timely questions. These included things like, what are the evidence-based hospital safety practices that are also applicable to the ambulatory care setting? Secondly, what are ambulatory care practices that have been studied in the literature? Third, which ones have been broadly implemented or studied through a single ambulatory care center? And then finally, are there tools, settings, and other factors, such as implementation of team-based care, that can influence and implement the spread of ambulatory care safety practices? So I would highly recommend you take a look at this. It has great application to TeamSTEPPS and the work that you're going to be doing in your home practice. I'll point out a couple of interesting things that came out of this technical brief. They honed in on a few safety topics. You can see the 5 listed here: medications, diagnosis, transitions, referrals, and testing, and then attempted to look at key safety strategies that could be highlighted. And even if you've just had a cursory glance as an introduction to TeamSTEPPS, you can see that many of these safety strategies crosswalk nicely with TeamSTEPPS philosophy and skills, whether it's communications, health IT, teams and teamwork, engaging with patients, what the overall organization does, and then this broad approach to creating a culture of safety. They noted that the characteristics that affect team performance are challenging, and many of these small practices lack the sophisticated electronic medical records and other tools. A lot of that, it just hinges on budget constraints, and unfortunately it's not just EHR, but the state that equipment is in, the ability to have redundant features that you might take for granted in a larger organization, and particularly in hospitals. It just doesn't exist in a typical small office. You don't have the referral and diagnostic resources readily available. So that's a challenge in and of itself. And then just looking at what the normal model of care is in an office setting. It's based on periodic visits. The time course of ambulatory care by nature is longer. We're talking weeks or months that can elapse between visits or getting diagnostic studies in. All of these create additional challenges to patient safety. Office-based providers obviously experience intense time pressure, and the current incentives are focused on seeing as many patients as possible in a small amount of time. And so we see that, particularly in small office settings, there is a lack of support for staff that are dedicated just to coordination of care among all of these different entities. All of this means a huge reliance on the patient, their family, to take on self-management of their own care. Again, setting up a huge challenge and risk and a reliance on good communication among the office staff and the patient. Let's talk just for a moment about the nature of staff and patient encounters in the office. In most offices, we see this as a sequential step-by-step where many individual staff members work autonomously. They have their tasks and communication with the patient, and then they're handed off. The patient is handed off to the next staff member. There's pros and cons of this. Some see that it sets up conditions for filtering through similar conversations and things that may be talked about with one staff member may get missed with another, but collectively all the information is gathered. Others, if you see some patient feedback statistics, they're starting to get bugged why everybody is asking the same thing. Doesn't one team member talk to another? So I've seen it work well. I've also seen it seem to be a very chaotic and inefficient engagement with the patient overall. The alternative to that is to try to create more opportunities for team encounters. So 2 or more team members may come in and be with the patient at the same time. Maybe there's a lead and an assistant. Those can be productive. They can also be overall inefficient for the nature of office practice. So I'm not advocating for one of the or the other. Each office setting provides a unique opportunity to experiment and see what's going to work best.
Hey Ken, this is Chris. I was curious, in your experience, do you find that people prefer working as teams rather than as individuals in that sequential model in the normal patient visit?
It's a great question. I'd say overall functioning as a team doesn't require all members to be in the same space at the same time, which is great because that's, as I mentioned, it's a rare occurrence in the office environment. I guess in response, I go back to some information I've learned through Dr. Eduardo Salas. As you know, Chris, he's a well-known cognitive psychologist, researcher in the science of teams and team performance. My go-to recollection of his message is what he calls collective efficacy, which really translates into a strong sense of team orientation. And so he characterizes teams as having task interdependency, distributed expertise, and they're hierarchically organized. So again, the members don't all have to be in the same space, but you have this still collective thinking and communication that gets the job done effectively. I can give you probably a good example from work I've done with a client organization where the actual new initiative was to install a electronic health record system. And they decided, this practice decided that what used to be the first stage of the interaction was to send the medical assistant in and go through a number of questions, which then they would scribe and send on to the physician or nurse practitioner who was coming to see them next. And when they rolled the EHR system out, they decided, well, we'll just have the medical assistant in the room at the same time as the clinician, and they will do their scribing right there. So their thinking was this would be a much more efficient approach. Well, the medical assistants took it as, you're cutting off my autonomy, a role that I really took seriously, and now you're forcing me into a, quote, lesser role. We were able to kind of work through this using TeamSTEPPS by showing that actually this position or new role for the medical assistant could be hugely valuable by serving as a way of maintaining situation awareness, observing the conversation rather than just being the scribe, looking at the body language. Is the patient and their family actually understanding what the clinician is saying? The ability to use call-outs and closed-loop communication, establishing that and maintaining that shared mental model and mutual support. So using those tools as well as characterizing how important they were really brought that medical assistant on board and saying, okay, my role is different, but it's vitally important.
Thanks, Ken. That's really interesting. Good answer, yeah.
Yep. So let's take a look at what I'd call some elephants in the office rather than in the room. And I'm not going to point these out as all negatives. In fact, I look at them as opportunities. But let's go through a few of these because they may resonate with your practice setting. The first one is what we call the MD effect. One of the hallmarks of TeamSTEPPS, of course, is finding one's ability to raise their voice and questions when it's in the interest of patient and staff safety. So the small office might tend to limit barriers and encourage staff to speak up, but unfortunately it can have the opposite effect, particularly when one or two physicians actually own the practice. And I've seen this play out a couple of ways. Both of them can be problematic. In one case, you have staff members, and this is often ones who most of their career has been in this one office setting, so they have little experience beyond this practice. They may make unrealistic assumptions that physicians are infallible in their clinical decision making. And what this creates is obviously a blinded follower phenomenon. The second could be others who may be a little more overall savvy to potential safety issues, and they would otherwise question a decision or behavior. They either lack the skill set or the assertiveness skills to act on behalf of their patients. The worst approach there would be individuals who've consciously decided that raising a challenge is not in their own self-interest from a job preservation point of view. The second elephant I would raise is the office manager, and particularly the power of the office manager. Obviously, that individual plays such a vital role that they're in a unique position to influence the culture of the office. I've worked in and with many medical and dental offices and have witnessed firsthand how much power office managers have to either enhance or dampen performance and morale of the staff. And I've heard firsthand that in places that are trying to implement TeamSTEPPS, it often comes down to the level of trust that the staff see in their direct report manager. And in the office setting, usually it is just the office manager that has that overarching position. It can make a huge difference whether TeamSTEPPS initiatives or others ever get off the earliest stage of implementation. The third elephant, the office naysayer. I'll go out on a limb suggesting that among your staff there's at least one individual that's pretty entrenched in the status quo and would probably oppose changes to their daily routine unless they see obvious personal benefits. Many of you have read Our Iceberg is Melting by John Cotter. You've been introduced to this individual in the form of the character No-No. They exist in all organizations. And so obviously they can't be ignored, and there needs to be a strategy of your change team in how to work best with this type of staff member, particularly in a small office where they can have outsized influence. And then the fourth elephant I'll bring up is the change team itself, which might seem counterintuitive. The interesting thing about the change team is I've worked with a number of organizations who've done quite a bit of pre-work to try to put the best change team together. And yet when I followed up with them after the fact, I realized that the change team never really took the opportunity to become a fully functioning team in its own right. It had great ideas coming out of the master training experience. It got their team all enthused. A program and plan was developed. And yet, because they weren't a fully functioning team, it just hit roadblock after roadblock and became a recipe for failure. If you look at the slide, shows work that goes way back into the 60s, Tuckman's 4 phases of growth. It's not a simple linear approach over time. There's the forming, storming, norming, and performing stages that he talks about. And that storming stage can let a lot of air out of the balloon as early functioning teams realize, hey, we're maybe not all on the same page. We start to question one another. Whose role are you really doing? I thought I was doing that. No, I'm the other person is. So just recognition that the change team itself needs some work before they launch into a successful initiative.
So Ken, a quick question for you.
Yeah.
Do you have any suggestions for working through some of those elephants that you've identified?
Well, a few ideas, Chris. I'd say if we look back at the office naysayer, for example, how do you approach that individual? I've seen some change teams who've said, well, let's just bring them on board. Let's put them on the change team, and that way they can't claim that they weren't involved. In theory, that can work well. The most important component of that approach, though, is what role do they actually play? I would advocate for using an individual like that to their best advantage. And in many organizations, they use what are called red teams. And these can be 1 to 2 individuals, really, whose role on in new initiatives is actually their overall goal is to see success of the initiative. That's number 1. But they contribute to that effort by looking at every way that the initiative can fail. And they bring that to the attention of the rest of the team. So they're much more than just devil's advocates. They actively look to find ways that things won't work and allow the team then collectively to figure out solutions. I think more broadly, though, the way that all of these elephants can be approached is we move to the next slide and look at what's known as organizational capacity for change. This really becomes an investment on the part of the office and the broader organization, if that's the case, to say, hey, these initiatives are worthwhile and let's put our best foot forward. This is a quote here you see from William Judge, who really looks at building the capability of an organization to do the effective preparation. So whether conditions change quickly and you need a response to that, or it's a very methodical approach, this change capacity has been determined to be valuable and a wise investment. Here's a little more graphic approach to this this idea. If you look at the very top rung here, these are the core business activities that any organization is taking on. So let's say you're a cardiology practice. What are those patient care and supportive activities that are necessary? Change efforts come up occasionally. That's the B work and supports the A work. Those are things like TeamSTEPPS or a new electronic medical record or a new service line that you're thinking of bringing in. Any of those things designed to improve organizational performance fit there, and yet just plugging that in by itself may not be enough. That's where change capacity comes in, these competencies in planning, leading, and sustaining the change efforts that support everything upstream. That brings me to the point of it's not a one-size-all approach to considering change and change management. There's plenty of options out there to digest, absorb, and figure out what applies best in your particular situation. I'd highly encourage you, though, to think about any change initiative as requiring work at the individual level, at the team level, and then more broadly at the organizational level. So you've been obviously introduced to John Cotter's work through TeamSTEPPS. I find that's particularly valuable at the organizational level. Also recommend work from researchers like Amy Edmondson. This just happens to be listed here, her book Teaming. The working team level switch is a strong recommendation for that level of change. And then if you look at work by the Granny Patterson and the rest of the crew with Vital Smarts, this is information that really pertains and hits home at the individual level. So these are just a few suggestions. The main point is one change approach is usually not enough and doesn't fit all. So here you are, you're going through master training, you're enthused, you may be a little overwhelmed. At the very bottom point here, you've got a real job to do, but now you're starting to assume all of these other roles, or at least hopefully among your change team, these are all being met. Lots of things to juggle and consider, and you know, you're going to have to sort this out.
So Ken, any suggestions for newly minted master trainers on how to successfully juggle all these roles and responsibilities without burning out?
Well, again, if you've seen one practice, you've seen one. So there's not a one-size-fits-all approach, but maybe a few lessons learned are in order here. I guess one of the top ones I'd recommend are master trainers and their change teams need to really appreciate the difference between what's deemed ownership versus buy-in. This particular component I've learned and been informed quite a bit from the Liberating Structures group. Henry Lipmanowitz in particular looks at things like ownership versus buy-in and really characterizes the difference is, as it sounds, you own it. You know, whether it's an idea, decision, or building the plan itself, you've participated in developing it, you have an understanding of it, you really believe in it, and you're ready to do whatever it takes to get it implemented. And my use of the word "you" here really means the entire body that's affected by it. Buy-in, that's just the opposite. That's somebody else's thing. And even though it may be a great initiative and philosophy and backed by plenty of evidence-based skills and tools, and I would put TeamSTEPPS squarely in that camp, just coming back, having taken a bite out of the golden apple and then telling everybody how great this is going to be, that's a heavy lift for many organizations to just accept. So the more you can, as master trainers, turn this over to and facilitate and manage the overall initiative, but the ownership has to reside in your staff, I think that's where it's going to work. I think practically speaking, as we talk about change teams, if you've got large umbrella organizations that own several small practices, one approach I've seen work is a overall guiding core change team. These are the strategic planning group. They see the big picture. They include some master trainers among them. But when it gets to the individual implementation at an office practice level, that's where you want to think about deputizing sub-teams that truly represent those practices, and most importantly, give them the authority to own the change in that individual office setting. So there may be some core approaches that apply to all of the practices, but you've got to allow for individuality at the office level. Another key lesson is just that the conditions that senior management establishes can really be a make or break feature. I'd mentioned Dr. Eduardo Salas earlier. Here's a graphical representation of a key heuristic that he refers to. He calls these the 7 C's that build the likelihood that you're going to have high reliability teams, a high reliability organization, and then with the endpoint being a culture of safety. And you can see all of these important terms that start with a C, and communication is obviously one of the hallmarks, and yet he recognizes that the organization establishes the overall conditions within that environment, and if they don't provide the backup by recognizing and reinforcing good performance, making resources accessible, giving the necessary information as available to staff, and aligning policies and procedures and incentives, that just ends up becoming a recipe for failure. And in my experience, I can endorse that philosophy. I've seen it.
Ken, so how do you think owners and senior executives of office practices come to appreciate the benefits of investing in a true culture of safety? And I guess what I'm saying here is, how do you really get them to get past talking the talk? Because a lot of people do that. A lot of people say, of course, safety, safety, safety. How do you get them to actually walk the walk?
Excellent point. In some practices, it's fairly easy, particularly when the owner, physician, office manager see this as in the best interest of the overall practice. They can become the biggest advocates and then end up owning and setting up these organizational conditions. In other cases, though, I think it still comes down to making that business case. TeamSTEPPS does a nice job in providing materials that master trainers and their change teams can use to go to senior leadership and make that business case. let me try to summarize it though in pretty short order. And this applies to small office, medium-sized office, small and large organizations that deal in patient safety. Paul Shivey has been with the Joint Commission for many years, and including serving as one of their senior vice presidents. And he paints it fairly basically as you read it here. So if you take any activity that's going to promote patient safety, if it provides stakeholder satisfaction, and that includes patient, family, and staff, and it's aligned with the organization's mission, vision, and values, that's ideal, okay? The challenge then is, are these activities delivered efficiently and effectively? Only then can you really make the determination that it's effectively, positively affected the financial bottom line. And here's a little different way of looking at the same thing. So even small offices, I would encourage them to take the time and develop a vision, mission, and value statement. So first of all, is the activity meeting those? Secondly, when you look at it from that stakeholder standpoint, are those activities positive? And then thirdly is when you can look at and assess whether it's effective and efficient. And the money then could flow from that. And these are opportunity costs as well as the initial cost of putting these changes into place. I'd also point out that with things like TeamSTEPPS, it's not just that initial funding of the effort. I would argue that a highly functioning team environment, a culture of safety, using TeamSTEPPS principles and tools, additional activities that come to bear are more likely to be effectively and efficiently carried out just because the culture of teamwork is embedded. A couple more lessons learned and we'll wrap this up. I hear from a number of practices, and I've observed this, that yes, we're interested in TeamSTEPPS, we're interested in other things, we want to get to this broader culture of safety, and yet the staff sees it as just complicated, one more initiative, one more bolt-on thing. And so how can we effectively embed TeamSTEPPS principles without losing sight of the bigger picture? And it's a challenge. I agree. And I think this goes back to this whole component of or philosophy of own it and brand it. So the beauty of TeamSTEPPS is you don't have to use specific labels. You don't have to buy it in total. You can selectively and strategically apply the tools as needed. I've found working with some clients who found success by not naming it as a brand new overarching initiative. They use what's called a stealth strategy, and they look for opportunities to introduce a particular tool, which they know as TeamSTEPPS, but they bring it to the rest of the staff in a way that just makes sense. The staff owns it. You kind of give them the lead, and they come up with the ideas and the opportunity to introduce the tools themselves. Brief's a perfect example where I've seen that work effectively, or other elements. And then finally, from the lessons learned standpoint, everybody's busy in all practices, but small offices, you're going in so many different ways with so few total staff that you really have to look for opportunities to bring in training, coaching, sharing progress wherever you can. And that means looking for dedicated training time, which can be rare. More likely, you're going to have to bring in introduction of new steps and tools on an ad hoc basis. I'd strongly recommend looking at things that you are obligated to do periodically, mandatory drills, whether it's fire safety or CPR. If you're an accredited facility, you need to show that those are done periodically. But I'd prefer actually going to actual hands-on simulations rather than just walking through and checking a box that you did the drill. And in doing so, what I recommend you do is separate the technical components of those drills with the teamwork component. It's also a great opportunity to hone in on your debriefing skills, because any training, and particularly simulations, should conclude with debriefs, because that's where the true learning occurs. That may take a little extra staff development to have individuals who are good at that, but on the short-term basis, you could find local experts to come in and help you with that until you have the internal capacity and capability to carry those on yourself. And then never lose the opportunity to communicate and reward those short-term wins that you see. Those can be really infectious and build upon one another within the office setting. So I think I'll conclude there, and thank everyone for their time and attention, and best of luck in this journey, because it can be very, very rewarding.
Ken, thank you so much. I really appreciate it. You answered all my questions, and there's some really great lessons learned for everybody in this. So thank you all to those that have listened in today on this webinar, and we look forward to seeing you again on another webinar for the TeamSTEPPS for Office Space Care online course. Thank you again.